If you're like me, you want to leave a lasting legacy for your loved ones. But what if your legacy is ruined by family strife, a lengthy probate, or your kids ending up with the wrong person raising them? Proper estate planning can solve and avoid all of these problems, and also protect your legacy. Today, we're going to talk about the differences between a trust and a will and who needs what. This is a wealth planning podcast with Brister Law. My name is Anthony Brister. Thank you for joining me today. So, do you need a will or a trust? The answer probably will surprise most of you. I'll leave that to the end. But again, the real important thing is that you do have an estate plan. Everyone needs an estate plan. If you've got assets, even if you don't have assets, you should have at least some form of power of attorneys to make sure that if you become incapacitated, you've chosen who's going to make those financial or medical decisions on your behalf. So let's talk about what a will is. A will is just a legal document that outlines how to distribute your assets after death. It also can appoint guardians for your minor children. Now, a trust is also a legal document, and it really sets up a fiduciary relationship between a trustee and a beneficiary. And you also have a grantor, who is the person who funds the trust, so actually puts assets inside of the trust. Today, we're just going to talk about a revocable living trust in the terms of estate planning. There's various different types of trusts out there, but we're going to talk about a revocable living trust today. What are the key differences between a will and a revocable living trust? Well, it's probate process. We've got control and management, privacy considerations, also the flexibility and changing it, and control upon incapacitation. So let's talk about probate first. So when you have a will and that's it, or even if you don't have a will, you're going to have to go through probate. So a will guarantees that you go through probate with no other planning. A revocable living trust, if funded properly, can avoid probate. So I'll say that another way. Probate is optional if you have a revocable living trust that is funded correctly and or other non-probatable assets. If all of your assets fall under a will, you will go to probate. Second, control and management. So a revocable living trust is controlled via the trustee position. Typically, the revocable living trust, the trustee is going to be the grantor or grantors. So those people who are actually funding the trust. Common scenario, you have the parents, they're going to form the trust, put all their assets in it, and then the beneficiaries will be the kids. As long as the parents are both sound mind and living, they will control those assets and have the flexibility to change the trust. If something happens to one of them, typically, again, depending on how the language is drafted, the other co-trustee can continue on managing the affairs of the trust without having to go through probate. The will, on the other hand, you can change it just like a trust as long as you're of sound mind and living. However, the executor or executrix, those are just really related to male, female, same term though, executor, executrix, that is going to be the person responsible distributing your assets upon probate once you pass away. after going through probate. So that's control and management. Trustee, successor trustee will distribute assets after the grantor's passing. Executor does the same job after probate, going through probate. Next up, let's talk about privacy. So privacy is a big deal, especially for a lot of my business owners. They don't want their assets out in public record if they can avoid it. We do a lot of structuring just to keep their name out of the public eye. When you have a will and your estate plan is just solely through that will, and you go through probate, that probate is a public process. So you actually put out a notice to creditors. There's something called an inventory as well, which lists all your assets. All of this goes through the court and it is public information. Whereas a revocable living trust avoids probate, it is more private. There's less out there to the public, and you don't file the revocable trust really anywhere typically. Now, there are some scenarios where you might want to file the trust with the county clerk, but talk to an attorney about that. Lastly, flexibility and changes. So, really for a will or a trust, as long as you're alive and of sound mind, you typically can change your trust. Same thing with a will. The one thing about a trust versus a will is with a will, if you're married, both spouses have to have that will, whereas a trust, they don't. So if something happens to one spouse in a trust, typically that other spouse still has that power to change provisions and stuff. However, you can put some provisions in your trust to limit that. Typically, we do that with second marriages or mixed blended families. Really, though, as long as you're of sound mind and living, you should be able to change your will or your revocable living trust. So what are the advantages, pros and cons of having a will or having a trust? Well, let's talk about wills first. The advantages of a will, typically they're a little bit cheaper on the front end. It's less work on the person whose will it's going to be. You just have to decide what you want and where do you want those to go. Where do you want your assets to go? However, the downsides of a will are that you have to go through probate. It is a public process. It is a court process too, court proceedings. So you can have a contest on the will. You can also get contested on a trust. However, the will, there's already a proceeding going in place, proceeds, and people have an opportunity to come forward without having to go too much out of pocket. I've seen probate last, almost a decade with a client that I've had whose family is fighting over family land and how to split that up. I've also seen probate last as little as a month and a half. It really just depends on your family dynamic, where you pass away, what county you're living in, residing in when that happens. But it can be real simple, or it can be really lengthy and ugly and cause a lot of strife between your family, depending on what assets you have and your family dynamic. So let's talk about the pros and cons of a trust, a revocable living trust. First off, you avoid probate. I also think that having a revocable living trust saves you money overall. You might pay a little bit more upfront for the revocable living trust, but you're not paying for two separate wills. You're not paying for two separate probates either. So overall, you end up paying less. And you also lock in your cost when you have that trust up front. So you're paying in today's dollars, where when you have a will, you're guaranteeing going through probate, that number is a floating number. And just like every other business, lawyers raise their fees with inflation. Um, so probate costs are going to continue to go up with inflation. The disadvantages of the trust really are, one, again, like I said, it's a little bit more upfront. You also have to do a little bit more groundwork. So you have to fund, for the trust to work, you have to fund it. So you have to get organized, you have to retitle assets. Really, those are the biggest things, and change beneficiaries to the trust, right? Depending on what type of accounts there are. Um, but overall, again, you're avoiding the probate. And instead of your heirs having to do the work, finding where all your assets are, you do that while you're living. I have a personal story, really. If you are a parent, you need to have an estate plan. Accidents happen all the time. You're driving down the road. Um, if you're in a dangerous occupation, anything like that. If you've got minor kids, make sure to have an estate plan. If you don't, then state law will determine where your kids go, first off. And again, that might not be who you want to raise your kids. It also can cause tension between family members. So, personally, my mom passed away when I was 10. She didn't have an estate plan. My biological father gave up his rights. Uh, we were adopted by an ex-stepdad who has since been divorced. Uh, so we went to our grandparents right after my mom passed away. However, my ex-stepdad technically had legal rights. Now, I know my mom probably wouldn't want us to go to him, but he technically had the legal rights since he had adopted us. Uh, so it ended up in a long battle. It got ugly. My grandparents' aunt got arrested at my mom's funeral. My brother and I didn't get to attend. Um, at the wake, we pretty much jetted across state lines. Technically, we were kidnapped by our grandparents. Uh, it was terrible. It was ugly. Caused a lot of trauma for my brother and I, not getting that closure. We pretty much got one of the worst ends of it. This all could have been avoided by simply having a will and naming who my mother wanted to raise us if something were to happen to her. It all worked out. I think we ended up with the right people. But again, it got ugly during the funeral and time where we were supposed to be grieving and we didn't really get to do that. So, as a parent, I know it's hard to think about death, but you really want to take care of your kids. You want to make sure that they end up with the right people who share the same values as you. Um, and you don't want them to miss that opportunity when they're supposed to be grieving and getting closure to, have to deal with family strife. It can hold a lot of resentment. So make sure you name guardians. At the very least, have a will and do that. Your assets are one thing, but your kid's life, you know, typically I would assume that your kid's life and how they end up means a lot more than the material assets that you have. So let's answer the question, who needs a will or who needs a trust? I'll say that most people actually need both a will and a trust. So I always recommend, or not always, most of my clients, I'm going to recommend a revocable living trust, especially for those business owners and real estate investors who have properties in different states. We don't want to go through probate in different states. I like the revocable living trust because it is private and avoids probate. Um, However, the will is a little bit more cost effective for those who want to be conscientious. But even if you do go down the revocable living trust route, you still need a will. That's because people forget things, they buy things. We're constantly buying things all the time, and we might not retitle the assets, or we might have a crazy uncle out in Montana that we never knew about that left all his land to us. Um, so we have a document called a pour over will, which works in tandem with the trust, and it really is there as a fail safe to catch anything that we did not put into the trust or name the trust as a beneficiary. And those assets that get left out of the trust have to go through probate, but then typically get pushed to the revocable living trust. Uh, so that's really the differences between the trust and the will. Trust, you're being proactive, you're doing the work, you're funding it, you've got that flexibility throughout your life, and you're avoiding probate. Wills typically are standstill, no actions really needed until you pass away, and then you have an executor, executrix distributing your assets. So that was the estate planning basics and the differences between a trust and a will. Everybody, every adult should have some form of estate plan. If you don't have an estate plan, holidays are coming up. I know, you're getting around family members. Now is not a great time to be thinking about death and all of that, but go get a estate planning meeting with an attorney at the Brister Tax Law. You can set up a discovery call. Go to bristertaxlaw.com, set up a discovery call. We've got a really streamlined process for our estate planning process. One of my paralegals will hop on the call and walk you through our process. Get this done, especially you parents. You don't want an accident or something like that ruining your legacy, or your children going to someone who you didn't want to raise them. So, my name is Anthony Brister. Please like and subscribe. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, social media, YouTube, Apple, Spotify. If you have any questions, please drop a comment, or feel free to DM me personally. Thank you for your time, and look forward to the next episode. Thank you.